many of you will know, was founded back in 2015, and we at CN have long been supporters of it. And when Chris and Andy Koppel decided that they might like to down tools a little bit, we took over running it. It's been a real delight to be part of, even more a core part of a community that we respect and admire. So it's been a lot of fun. The club itself, as you know, is all about networking and debates, and tonight is one such. What I'm hoping tonight is not that you come away thinking that the FCA and sandboxes are wonderful things, or that you go away thinking that they're horrible things, but that you go away thinking. That's all that we'll really hear about tonight, is that you engage the debate. I frequently noted that in an industry that likes to pride itself on being iconoclastic and independent, actually we're very much herd followers in financial services. If you look at the fact that active management is very rarely taking a different view, and in fact the best product around at the moment is in fact tracker funds, which are widely touted, you begin to wonder, hang on a minute, if what we've done is use technology to track the market, are we really providing independent advice and thinking? And that's what we'd like to challenge tonight, just a bit of independent thinking. The club itself provides a lot of services, quite a few of them free. I would commend to you Chris Skinner's blog, which comes out on a daily basis. And we are launching over the next few weeks some exciting, independent, highly targeted newsletters for people who'd like to receive them on very specific areas in financial services, about 45. So things like just on asset management or just on reinsurance, specific areas that you can delve into. Naturally, we'd like it if you were members, so I'll leave it at that. And James Pitcher at the back. James, hold your hand up there so we can see it. James would happily talk to any of you who are non-members about how to join. The web page is, of course, full of things, and there's a picture of tonight's speaker there on the top right. So there we go. In the course of doing this, one of the reasons we at CN were excited was the ability to merge a lot of FS Club work with our own initiatives in long finance. And between the two bodies, we've hosted some 1,600 events over the last 10 years. It's an astonishing number, and really does make me quail. It probably makes my staff quail even more, because I don't do anything except come on and put on a name badge. But they've done a tremendous number of things in a whole variety of areas. And I would encourage you equally to have a good look at the long finance site. And as of next week, all three sites, CN, Long Finance, and FS Club, will be pulled together. The distinction here is really that we're adding to FS Club a tremendous amount of free research in a whole variety of areas. So whether you're interested in identity systems, mutual distributed ledgers or blockchains, or reinsurance on cyber, there's something there for everybody. And much of it is, in fact, quite detailed and deep. Now, tonight's presentation, you've read about Myles, and one of the things we like to do here is really kind of get into the thick of it quickly. After Myles has done his talk, we have two panelists, Michael and Richard, who are going to come up and comment on it. What we're hoping is that you will kick in with questions and comments of your own. So I'd like you to take some notes and really go for it. But before I hand over to Myles, I thought a few remarks from the chairman might be important, really to set the scene, because Myles is going to be presenting one firm's journey through the FCA, and quite rightly, and this will be his experiences. But I might ask you to back out a teensy bit. I'd pull you back to about December 2015. Andrew Tyree is giving the Financial Conduct Authority a little bit of hassle at the time. He's basically saying to the FCA, where are all these challenger banks? At that time, they said that there were about 5 of them. They had about 25 applications from memory. But some of them were sort of the Tyneside fly fishing bank and things like that, and they decided that what they'd like to do is, see how well these went. And he gave them quite a bit of aggravation. Tyree had, in fact, written a report back in 1999 for the Center for Economic Policy Studies, pointing out that a unitary regulator was likely to lead to consolidation and lack of competition. And this report has been, sadly, largely predictive. The concentration in UK banking has in fact increased since '97, when the FSA was created as part of the unitary regulator under the Labour government. And Tyree's argument was that in many ways competition is the basic form of regulation. If you can get competition right, then a lot of the other things are easier to handle. If you don't get competition right, then you do need an extremely strong regulator. Now, I come at this from a slightly different point of view. I sit on the board of a regulator, the United Kingdom Accreditation Service. We regulate the other, arguably, 92% of the economy, sort of the non-government economy. And we handle things like oil rigs and aircraft and all those boring little things. And financial services sees itself as somehow special. It needs a special regulator. And there are good reasons for that. I would argue financial stability is an interesting one in terms of macroeconomic stability. The control of the issuance of money supply it is an important part of the economy that doesn't fall under those traditional regulatory items. But what of it? Well, given the criticisms back in December 2015, we had a response which was in March of 2016 at Innovate Finance. The FCA announced it was going to have a sandbox. And this got a lot of good press and seemed like a good thing to do at the time. I might point out that they claimed that they'd already helped well in excess of 200 firms. And that this was just a formalization. These were the original statements. It was just a formalization of what they were already informally doing. I might also point out that Zien was one of those firms. We had rung them about what standards might apply to distributed ledger technology, and they didn't even know what we were talking about, but we were on the list of firms that they formally assisted in their 2-minute phone call. So you get somebody, so there's one audience for this, and a lot of people say the audience is to startups, the audience is to investors, the audience is to country. But please don't forget that the initiation of this was the audience was also Westminster. So I think that's an important point. Well, it gets going, and then it's so popular, in fact, that they shut it down. And they shut it down because there are not enough civil servants to go around. So as I traveled the world, I got some pretty interesting comments from people. So innovation in the United Kingdom is exactly what the civil servants will permit, which doesn't seem like quite what we wanted to do. Or any country that relies on the quantity of civil servants to process things has got an innovation problem of its own. Now, I'm doing this because I think it's important to realize that this is not a panacea. It's an experiment. It's an interesting experiment. But it is not, despite what the British press says, widely regarded as the best thing. So there are countries, for example, I sat on the International Financial Services Board for Ireland for 3 years, and we had vigorous debates with the CBI, their regulator, Central Bank of Ireland. And the Central Bank of Ireland said, keep your sandbox. If you want to promote an industry, by all means promote it, but that's not our job as a regulator. And the French took a similar view. Now those views are changing. The UN reported some 20 sandboxes by the end of last year, and I think we'll hear from the panelists, they vary widely in quality, but they also vary widely in their remit, and they vary widely in the types of sectors that they're trying to attract. I might point out that when it first came up, I thought the sandbox was a great idea. It'd be really good if our 5 major banks had a place where they could genuinely experiment with new technology and not get it in the neck from the regulator. I happen to bank with RBS. If you ever bank with RBS and you look at their systems and compare them with anything that's out there, it's very clear they need some place where they can experiment. But I sympathize, it's actually very hard for them to experiment. And so this ability to take in a bunch of real customers and test all that could have particular merit, but it might not be in the fintech area. Second thing is when the competition seized up, we found an interesting problem in the United Kingdom. People who'd applied to the sandbox were, of course, naturally touting it. We are in the sandbox. Now, investors aren't as bright as we like to think they are. And the investor said to the next person who comes in the room, are you in the sandbox? And God, well, no, we're not. Well, why is that? Well, because the FCA shut it down. So they shut it down because you're not good enough to get into the sandbox. And there was a decent cohort of folks that went over to Berlin at that time. Well, if you can't get into the sandbox in the UK, you might as well go over to Berlin, where there are 1,800 banks you can sell to if you're in the fintech arena. And at least, the investors there aren't saying that this is some sort of cutoff line. So it happened. And in fact, Myles has got on his site at least 2, maybe 4 mentions of we're in the FCA, and we're FCA regulated in the FCA Sandbox as part of his pitch. It's a natural pitch that I would do if I was any kind of a startup. But is that really the case, that the regulator in some way is assessing the quality of these things as investments? Now the answer is clearly no, the regulator would say that, but we know that that's not quite the way that investors might look at it. And so these are the sorts of questions I'd like us to explore tonight. not anti-sandboxes, but I think it's important to present a little bit of weighting towards the other side. And I'm hoping tonight Myles will give us what it's really like to experience the journey, and our two panelists will open it up, and we can all then debate the economic impact and implications of this. So thank you very much, and Myles, over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm CEO and founder of Globacap. So, while we're getting the slides up, so great. So that's interesting. It's an interesting viewpoint, and I'm sure that's the case in a lot of situations. Certainly wasn't our experience when we were raising funds. Investors didn't really view the sandbox as a stamp of approval, so to speak. But certainly I can see why that would apply in some situations. Okay, so to get started, I think it helps to, this isn't meant to be about us and hey, we're wonderful. It's meant to be about the journey of through Sandbox. In order to give you the background into why we made some of the decisions we did and what that meant for us, I think it's necessary to give you a quick overview of who we are. So, first of all, we are an automated capital markets platform. That means digital securities, it means arranging, and digital securities, by the way, means blockchain, equity and debt securities in blockchain. It means issuance, administration, custody, and all of that automated. We are a background that's come from financial markets. We're not just a group of tech people that have come along and said, hey, this blockchain stuff is cool, let's do something in financial markets space now. My own background, Morgan Stanley, Macquarie Bank. I started a firm called LBM Trading, which was trading commodities on an automated basis for several years successfully, and unfortunately 1 year unsuccessfully, couldn't fix the strategies. Then went to be CTO of a gambling tech company called Colossus and helped that company grow to just over 50 B2B partners around the world. My co-founder Alex, 18 years, Citibank, JP Morgan. Joe, who's our COO and CFO, has been an advisor to private equity funds like Equistone, and our wider team comes from financial markets and fintech world generally. We also, our board and our advisors, again, are very much from financial market space, and particularly plugged into Europe, and that's a relevant point which we'll come back to later, relevant for some of the decisions we made. So, what did we need to do? Well, first of all, what did we want to do as a company, and then what authorizations do we need to get there, and how do we go about doing it? So, on the primary issuance side, we focused on equity and debt capital raising, on creating offering documents, creating online versions, templated, streamlining all of it to crush those costs for issuers, all of the investor suitability, KYC, background checks, AML checks, OFAC checks, patent checks, etc., building the actual order book, issuing securities, and then, of course, on the post-issuance side, administration of those securities, corporate actions, buybacks, dividends, stock splits, and because these are digital securities, the intention here is entirely automated, no paper trail, a few clicks of a button, done. Distributions, investor communication, and then custody, safeguarding of client assets and client money. Great. So, can we just do that without any authorization? No. Those are all regulated activities. On this side, it's arranging, quite a few actually regulated activities, but primarily arranging deals and investments, and on the other side, safeguarding administration, otherwise known as CAS in the UK. So how do we get to the point where we're trying to do this new technology, blockchain, creating digital securities, trying to automate a lot of these processes which traditionally have been manual to this point, and get authorized, therefore getting regulators comfortable with those new processes at the same time. Okay, well we could, option one, just apply for outright authorization. Here you go, FCA. Here's our application to become a custodian and an arranger. What do you think? Several months later, most likely, blockchain securities what? And then probably a recursive process. So a friend of mine started a more traditional crowdfunding platform focused on the sports sector. He took 18 months to get regulated, and there was nothing particularly innovative about that compared to what we're doing. So I didn't like our chances in going down that approach. So the alternative, let's look at sandboxes. At the time that we were starting out and applying, which is, well, late 2017, but really January 2018 was when we were seeking how to get authorized. So at that point in time, there was a sandbox in Canada, there was a sandbox in the UK, there was a sandbox in Lithuania, which will come up eventually, and also Hong Kong and Singapore. Maybe won't come up eventually. Let's see. Okay, keep clicking. Just try pressing next on the keyboard, see if that works. A couple more. Fiddle with the batteries a bit, always seems to work at home with remote control. And Australia, of course. So, I think that stopped working. Okay, so before we get to the US, those are the options on the table, excluding the US part. For us, Canada, not really the market we're going after anyway, not really relevant. Australia, again, too far removed. Singapore, we very seriously considered. Lithuania, we didn't really consider, the reason being we're trying to create a platform for institutional investors, institutional segment. We didn't really consider Lithuania to be credible enough. Hong Kong, the sandbox, yes, they do have a sandbox, but actually in reality, it's very limited in its construct. So really that left Singapore and UK for us. Given one of the earlier slides where actually our board is comprised of quite senior people in financial markets here in Europe, and our own backgrounds have relationships in Europe, we opted for the UK as a natural point. Since we applied for and entered the sandbox in the UK, other countries too have come online include, as there are a ton, as Michael mentioned, but I'm just putting up the major ones here. The US.
Other way.
Is that a new clicker?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, so the US, Netherlands, which I don't know much about, but I have seen that they are online. Thailand and Malaysia. And from my own opinion, and this is just purely opinion, I would consider those the ones worth considering compared to the 20 or so that are out there. Thailand, I mean, don't write that off. It's the largest economy in Southeast Asia. Malaysia, yeah, okay, it's well positioned. It's still part, it's got 20 million people and it's right next to Singapore and Thailand, etc. Netherlands, now that's interesting because, well, okay, we'll come back to that later with the Brexit question. So, moving on, FCA Sandbox stats. We went for the UK, so let's focus on the UK. So yes, the UK sandbox, and probably most sandboxes, are predominantly startup focused. However, there is about a bit less than 20% of which are not startups. And here are some examples in the last two cohorts. So there have been, up to the time that Mike was talking about, there were 3 cohorts. And then we were in cohort 4, which was basically all of last year. And then cohort 5 is going on right now. So in cohort 4 and 5, here are some of the large caps that are in that sandbox. So LSE, great, interesting. NatWest, interesting, Standard Chartered, right. British Heart Foundation, Post Office, that's really interesting. In both of those cases, actually I'm not sure for British Heart Foundation, in Post Office they're actually using distributed ledger technology as a trial. In NatWest and LSE they are also using DLT, blockchain. Standard Chartered I'm not actually sure, in British Heart Foundation I'm not sure, but nonetheless I think this isn't just a question about startups coming to trying to get to market quicker with new tech. This is also a way for big companies to try to innovate the way that they're doing things and improve their experience and improve their product offering. So I think that needs to be considered throughout the rest of the evening. So cohorts 1 to 3. There were 146 applications between all of those 3 cohorts, so roughly 49 per cohort. 41 in total came to actually execute trials. And I'll explain what that means a little bit later. And 22 of those were blockchain, so fairly blockchain heavy in those first 3. Cohort 4, which we were a part of, there were 69 applications, 29 came to actually execute trials, and of those, 10 were blockchain related, so a diminishing number, which is interesting, I think. And then cohort 5, which is going on right now, there were 99 applications, 29 went through again, and then only 5 were blockchain related. So that just shows, I think, there's a lot of other stuff going on in the sandbox than just this blockchain revolution, so to speak. Right, so. Okay, this is how long it took us in total. And that, yes, that's right up to now, basically. We've just emerged completely out, and I'll explain what that means in a little bit. From January to May, it's kind of almost a year and a half. It's quite a long process. I still imagine it would have been a much longer process with the novel stuff that we're doing had we not gone through the sandbox process. And I believe there's some good reasons why the sandbox was still effective for what we're doing. But nonetheless, it was quite a long journey in total. So let's go through each of the stages. I've divided this into roughly the application stage, what that means, what the FCA Sandbox is looking for in that application, preparation for the actual trial itself, the execution stage, and then the exit. And as we'll see in a little bit, those don't always follow in logical order. So what is the FCA actually looking for? What is it about in their own words and from our own experience from being accepted? So first of all, they ask for, the application is really one long form, which if you fill it out in a day, then I don't think you're doing a justifiable job. It's really, it's quite, even though it's not that lengthy, it's a very detailed form. These are really the four main components of what we're about and what we're doing, what the FCA is looking for. So first of all, a summary of the actual innovation itself. Secondly, how is that innovation related to a regulated activity, whether that's our own business doing that regulated activity or us supporting another regulated business. And there have been quite a few trials and sandboxes from non-regulated businesses supplying regulated businesses, but doing it in a different way. How is the idea groundbreaking? And this is part of what the sandbox is looking for, true innovation. And then lastly, how does it provide consumer benefit? And this is the most important out of the lot, and it was stressed to us at length at various points along the journey. Because ultimately, it's not just about, for the FCA, it's not just about a company coming in to make more money. It's about some tangible benefit to consumers. And that either comes via reduced costs, via increased product offering, or via increased competition. And those are the three main benchmarks. So I'm going to relate how that applied to us. So what was our consumer benefit? In our case, we were aiming to crush issuance costs for mid-cap issuers. So right now, if you're a mid-cap issuer, you want to go and list on the LSE AIM market, hey, it will cost you an average of 11% of the funds raised to do that, which in my opinion is extortionate. So we brought that down to 3%, and that was our goal. And we haven't necessarily achieved all of that. We've achieved it in some examples and not others, but that was what we're driving for. We've templated all the online offering documentation. Again, this isn't meant to be a sales pitch. It's meant to relate back to exactly what this meant for us in Sandbox. Templated all the offering documentation, made it streamlined, brought it online, made it entirely interactive, videos, links to LinkedIn, new way of doing it, tracking everything that the actual investor is doing. Therefore, if there's a dispute later on, you can also refer back to that and go, well, hey, you didn't actually look through all the terms and pages 3 and 4, but you did look at pages 5 and then you just went to invest. Investing, making that really easy, click of a few buttons and we're done. Through to, from an issuer's perspective, getting a lot more control and transparency in that entire capital raising and issuance process. Benefit number 2, and there are 3 benefits that we were focusing on. Benefit number 2, the administration of those securities. So for ourselves, in our seed, or actually not our seed, in our angel round, which was January last year, we spent £12,000 on legal fees to a small backwater law firm who we'll never use again over the course of 2 months. And that was for relatively basic administrative type stuff, including managing the share certificates and all that kind of stuff. Our platform now does all of that stuff that law firm did. Our platform charges £500 a month, so over the course of 2 months that would be equivalent to reducing their cost to £1,000 for an issuer. So that was the second benefit. And managing the cap table, and doing a stock split, and paying out distributions, and messaging shareholders, all of that with a few clicks of a button as well. And electronic share certificates, cryptographically signed, which had never been done in the UK or anywhere in the world before. So that also was a point of innovation which hadn't been tested, a slight deviation from our main focus, but nonetheless, this is something which hadn't been tested. Can an issuer actually do this? Is it going to be defensible in a court of law? Is the FCA going to actually say it's definitely okay? No, they never do that, but they do say when it's not okay, and that's part of what was valuable here. Right, and the third point, transferability. So, old school, if you want to transfer some private assets, be those shares or loans to a different investor, then that usually involves a wealth of intermediaries, lots of documents, lots of emails, hopefully no faxes anymore, but certainly scans, until eventually those assets are transferred. We've created a construct, and this helps to give you an illustration of what we're going about here and what the FCA had to come to terms with. We created a construct which essentially uses private blockchain for some of the legal components, such as the actual share register, and then we've intertwined that with public blockchain and allowed for easy transferability, but everything immediately updated. In other words, when a token transfers from one entity to another, there's immediate settlement of those assets in a completely legal context. And that allows for everything to happen without any input from any other intermediaries. So, we didn't have all of that built for the application. In fact, when we sent in the application, we were actually just really hiring a first developer. But really what the FCA looks for is, are you going to be ready to run your test when it comes time? Which for us was in July. And we felt confident that we could deliver at least enough of the prototype to be able to do that. So we marched on and said that we could. So, months 4, 5, and 6. Once we were accepted, what happened here was we had weekly calls with the FCA, which was absolutely astounding. So every firm that's in the sandbox is allocated quite a junior person relatively, but that's good because they're full of enthusiasm and they even respond to emails on the weekend. When has any government entity ever responded to an email on the weekend? Unbelievable. There was then a long process of setting up compliance, and that is everything from, well actually I'll explain in a second, and then we had a full test plan approval which needed to go through. So compliance stuff, I mean this was basically all of the stuff that we had to be fully authorized, right? But slightly scaled down in some contexts, which we had to have before we exited, but some of them were in depth, such as the client assets administration and client money policies, our tech outsourcing policies. We had to have a full tech tests done, penetration tests, everything else on infrastructure. And then we had to agree test restrictions. So what that is we're saying, okay, you're giving us this authorization. We are going to do these proposed transactions. Here are the details of the transactions, and these are the caps on the numbers of parties involved. So the numbers of investors, the aggregate deal cap. So it's kind of like authorizations with training wheels on. So we agreed all of that with the FCA first, then obviously had reg capital in place to do those transactions, and then the FCA then did a deep dive on us, and thankfully nothing came up. So then months 7, 8, so this was July and August last year, we executed our test. Now in this case, we had actually used ourselves as a guinea pig to do our first transaction. So we tokenized our own equity capital structure. Now, if you're familiar with regulation, that actually means that we didn't need to be authorized to do that. If you're a company issuing or fundraising for yourself, you don't need to be authorized. That is an exemption. But we were using this as a test to show how it would work for another company. Okay, great. We did it successfully. We were the first company in the world to issue equity in blockchain form without a nominee or SPV structure in the middle. This, in my opinion, is revolutionary. I'm really happy about it. That's why I'm in front of you going, hey, this is awesome. The FCA said, great job. And then the FCA said, could you do that again for a client, please? So we went back to preparation stage, which was a bit unfortunate because we were hoping to be live and doing real business by then, but unfortunately not. So September through to January involved essentially finding clients to work with to do that transaction stage, which was an iterative process, and we got a couple of great transactions in the end. And then also getting full authorization. So while the FCA had given preliminary approval to do our trial transaction, which didn't actually require any authorizations, in order to do the test for clients, acting as an arranger and as a custodian, we then needed to actually be put in the FCA register and given full authorization with those restrictions, as I mentioned earlier, with an aggregate deal cap, aggregate number of clients that we can deal with. And so we got there, and it took quite a while. Now this is an interesting point, because up until this point, we had been dealing entirely with the FCA Sandbox team, which, as I mentioned, respond to emails on the weekends. In my former life at Morgan Stanley, doing structured products, on our desk we actually did some structured products for retail. It wasn't my direct role, but I was involved in it a little bit. And I was familiar with dealing with the FCA from those points in time, and they were a nightmare to deal with. So now we get to the point where we're dealing with the real FCA, not the Sandbox FCA. So we're moving at a what's a fast car? A Lamborghini pace, and then we suddenly get to a VW pace, a broken down VW pace perhaps. And the longest point was essentially our CAS policy, so our client assets, client money administration policy, getting approval. So we submitted that to the CAS team in September. We got a response from the CAS team at the end, the very end, I think it was the 29th of November. And they had gone through and made a few markups that would have taken no more than half an hour. So, and then we had to fix those markups and add in some extra points that we were missing, and then go back to them again. And then we waited another 2 months until January, until finally they came back and said, okay, we're happy now. And then we were put in the FCA register and able to go ahead with our tests. So we did 2 great transactions, which helped to, first of all, help us test our own platform more. So I'm actually really happy that we did have to do this in the end, because we found some things which we were able to later improve. But secondly, it also then obviously helped the FCA to get more comfortable with the entire process and what was happening. And that, at this point in time, we're dealing with not just the Sandbox team, but also the full, so we had 2 kind of case officers. One was the Sandbox handler, who was with us right from the beginning. The other was our full authorizations handler, who again was kind of introduced to us around July and has been with us since then. And then various other parties, like someone in the CAS team and so on. But those 2 have been throughout and reviewed all of the steps. And so what they wanted to see at this point was feedback on what went wrong, what went right, what were our learnings from it, what were the tangible benefits to consumers. So in quantitative terms, what were the actual financial benefits, what were the time-saving benefits, anything else that went along with it. And there was a great deal of analysis around that. So I've got to say that for all of the bad press that the Sandbox gets, they were extremely thorough. There's you cannot say anything to the contrary for that. And then the last 2 months have essentially been seeking variation in our permission. So we have full authorization, but with limits on it. And so that's taken 2 months now to lift those restrictions. So that brings us to where we are now. So what's next for us? Well, we've got an active growing deal pipeline. We're providing custody for other capital raising platform entities. We're working towards a trial with 4 of the largest custodians in the world and 2 CSDs across Europe for public securities. What do we do about Brexit? This comes back to that first point. We're actually seeking authorization in the Netherlands. We don't really want to hang around and wait to see what happens. Are we seeking additional permissions? Yes, we are, because there's some more stuff that we'd like to do which our current permissions don't cover in our future roadmap. Are we going to use a sandbox to get to seek those additional permissions is probably the biggest question of this evening. And my answer to that is no, we're not going to do that. And the reason why I think the sandbox has been instrumental to get us to where we are. I think it's been instrumental to help to educate the FCA more about what we were doing. and about to create more awareness about why this is a good process, and to generally get market buy-in. However, all of that being done and reaching authorized status, I don't see for variations on that with additional permissions the need to then go through a lengthy sandbox process again. And let's be frank, it was a very time-intensive process. So that concludes it. Thank you very much.
Myles, thank you very much for that. That was a very cogent and interesting talk, and what I particularly liked was lots of good numbers there, and we're going to chat a little bit more about your journey as well. But I've asked to join us on the panel here. We have Michael Thomas from Hogan, Lovells, and Richard Little from Thought Machines, and both of them are going to make a little commentary, and then we're going to open up for the usual FS Club discussion. I was wondering, I think Richard, you're doing it first, if you don't mind. So you want to
Okay.
the microphone to there.
Does this work if I speak like this? Yes. Excellent. Well, thank you, Myles. I met Myles reminiscing on this earlier this evening. I met Myles with Globacap 12 months ago? Roughly. In the middle of this journey. In response to Michael's comments, I didn't know what a sandbox was then, and in a way, I still think it's a completely neutral thing for investors. I'm an investor, I'm an angel investor in tech businesses. Having been in banking software for sort of 30 or 40 years, it's morphed into fintech on my watch, and among the assets that get handled now are digital assets. And I've watched all this. We didn't invest in Globacap, and I'm clearly going to go home this evening regretting, but we didn't. I'm delighted and impressed with the journey. Myles made it seem easier than I suspected it was, particularly persuading cynical investors that it's actually going to work, because the regulatory environment is difficult. It compounds the problem of reading the market. And during the period in which certainly digital assets, or the infrastructure for digital asset handling has been developed by companies like Globacap, we've had the market for digital assets sort of going all over the place. Yeah, so it's been a particularly difficult environment to do this. There are two experiences that I had with regulation. The one that I wanted to contrast was, to give you a 20-second summary of Thought Machine, who did not seek regulation because we are selling banking software to banks, and we are leaving it for them to deal with the regulators. We're certainly innovating technically. We're building on blockchain and smart contracts to provide banking infrastructure, core banking infrastructure. But we've decided, in part because by avoiding anything more than a support role in regulatory discussions, we would position ourselves better to deal with better established banks. It's one of the difficulties that you face if you're innovating. It sounds a bit unkind, but what you don't want to do is to have all of your customers to be innovators as well. So what you want to do is to innovate in not too many dimensions at once. And so we decided we wanted to focus on larger, better established banks, so we wouldn't get our own regulatory consents. We'd get those with our customers. In a completely different phase, I'm also involved as an investor in a challenger bank that is not going to be buying technology from Thought Machine. It's not got particular technical challenges. It could run its system on much more basic and better established legacy hardware, legacy systems. But then we've been through the whole challenger bank process, which doesn't involve a sandbox, but does involve going through laborious testing. It does involve getting authorization with restrictions, and we're working through all of that. So what the sandbox does is it encourages startups, and it is probably less expensive than dealing directly with the regulator with a new system that you know is going to be subject to very substantial regulation. So I think, not that we're asked to form conclusions yet, but my general instinct will be that the sandbox does play a part where the innovation is particularly extreme. And I tend not to invest in areas where the innovation is particularly extreme, looking to limit the dimensions in which you're innovating. I like technological innovations. I'm pretty worried about market innovations, which makes me a bit of a dabbler and not fully committed to the crypto world. But congratulations, because you are definitely going straight in for a mainstream role in an emerging market of crypto trading, which is great.
Thank you very much, Richard. Michael, would you like to?
Michael, if I may, I just want to raise and do a quick intro for Michael because before Michael introduces himself, because we worked closely with Michael and Hogan Lovells throughout our process, and they were quite instrumental in helping us to form legal opinion and also to help guide the FCA throughout that journey. So thank you, Michael.
Thank you. Yeah, this was a very interesting piece of work. It was a very interesting proposition. I'm a financial services regulatory partner. We get all sorts of financial institutions authorised and regulated, whether they're startups, banks, or indeed pieces of market infrastructure like clearing houses. And you can see the whole range of different experience in each of those processes. And one of the things that never, always, sort of surprises me really is that even when you've got some of the biggest financial institutions wanting to set up a new organisation, a new subsidiary, a new trading business, and even a new retail bank, it's always a journey of discovery for those institutions as they try to work out how they're going to build this thing and how it's going to function. And of course, when you've got big projects like that, there's a lot of risk associated with it. There's risk in terms of the financial cost of setting the business up. There's risk associated with the timing of it. It's one of the key risks. And just being able to achieve whatever it is your original objective is, as the regulator imposes new demands as you go through the process. So I see that the sandbox does have a beneficial role to play. I mean, with what you were doing, it was the first, raising, issuing equity, that's not new, that's been going on forever. But doing it in the way that you were doing it and changing the process was different. And I think that the benefit of being in the sandbox for businesses like Myles and for other businesses that aren't new fintech startups is that it helps to educate the regulator. It helps to get some of those sort of questions about what it is you're trying to do, how the process is going to be different, and that's the reason why you're there in the first place, addressed early on in the process. The rationale for this thing is it's supposed to offer an innovation, a new way of doing things, albeit operating under the same financial services regulatory regime. And having a receptive regulator, having somebody where you've got a point of contact on a daily basis, who's able to answer questions, who's able to interrogate the business model and anticipate the future questions that the regulatory team will have with full authorization, is I think very beneficial. And that's why I think there's quite a lot of competition to get into the sandbox. You get the cohort of about 50, 45, 50 every 6 months, but there's a whole load of other firms that have applied for it now, and it's hugely whittled down. So I think the sandbox is a useful and interesting innovation. It is something which, it's not a substitute for regulation. It's not that sort of, eventually you are going to get authorised if you want to carry on and proceed with your business, and you're going to have to go through all of the hoops that a regulated firm is expected to go through. The FCA, particularly in this country, doesn't view the sandbox as offering any diminution to the regulatory standards. It's not going to be allowing it to be used as a means of circumventing the rules that are in place to manage systemic risk in our economy. But it's there to help firms to sort of get on a more gradual and again on a more, I suppose, enlightened path to where they need to get to. I think the process, it will evolve. It probably could be better in terms of, how they bring firms in and how they educate firms as to what they would be expected to do once they're in the process. We've seen a number of firms go into the sandbox and then they've landed there and then wondering, what are we doing now? What actual regulation does apply to us, what is the path to regulation? And I think there is an element to which I think the FCA, and I think probably has got better as their various cohorts have gone on, being able to say to firms, yes, get a clear idea of, or get the support you need to understand the regulatory framework that you're going to be moving towards, so that then we can help plan your journey better. But I think that will evolve as the sandbox sort of evolves over time. And the other thing as well is it's a national thing. It's not like MiFID or anything like that. There's no harmonised regulation for sandboxes. Authorisation is a national construct. But of course, modern financial institutions are, they have multiple touch points with other jurisdictions, whether it's jurisdictions where you're wishing to offer your securities or provide your services. And there's the regulatory due diligence that needs to be done in those jurisdictions too. And I think one of the things that will help in terms of the evolution of the sandbox idea is if you're trying to do it, if your test, your innovation is involves a multinational element to it, because you're looking to, say, issue securities into another European jurisdiction, then some form of cooperation between the regulator in the UK and the regulators in other jurisdictions would, I think, be helpful, so that you can perhaps have a sort of a more sort of beneficial and guided process for projects of that nature. I think the regulators are now starting to look at that, but how sophisticated it will be, I think, is yet to be seen. And also, some jurisdictions are just pretty anti the idea of sandboxes. It's the great quote being, was it the New York? State Department of Finance said, toddlers play in sandboxes, adults play by the rules. So, I think they're the only ones that have come out that strong against the sandbox, but it does at least give a great quote for evenings like this, but it is a point probably worth debating.
Excellent. Just a couple of questions before we open up the audience. I hope you're ready for your questions. The first thing was, Myles, just for clarity, you referenced a law firm in your presentation. You said you won't be using them again.
Oh.
And I assume that wasn't one.
No, not at all. It was a very small law firm that we used purely for the administrative stuff in the Angel round. That was before we came to Hogan. It wasn't. I won't, for fairness, I won't mention that law firm's name, but Hogan has been exceptional when we've dealt with it.
Okay. And Michael, you spoke about harmonization, right? Sort of international harmonization. What is the harmonizing? I mean, I thought the whole virtue of this was I could ring the civil servant, over the weekend or email them and really get into it. So what's the potential conflict?
Well, I mean, a lot of there's an element, well, there are some restrictions on what you can do in the UK sandbox. A lot of the UK financial services, a lot of the European financial services infrastructure is harmonised, but it's largely harmonising the conduct of business and the governance and financial institutions. What isn't harmonised are some elements that haven't been written into European law. So there isn't harmonisation of, for example, financial promotion rules. Also, the sandbox itself has limits to what the FCA is able to allow you to do that is, as a sort of a waiver from requirements that would apply to a fully authorised firm, because they can't waive requirements that derive from EU law. So harmonisation in some respects creates a limitation to the utility of the sandbox, because it narrows down what the FCA is able to allow in terms of its flexibility of behaviour within the sandbox. But also, because UK, some elements of financial services regulation have not been harmonised at a European level, when you're reaching out of the sandbox into another jurisdiction, there's still quite a burden of regulatory due diligence you have to do. For example, understand, well, what are the rules for me promoting my share issuance in this jurisdiction?
But isn't that kind of what's the whole purpose of this, was you were going to get it right locally and then reach out? You're saying, well, now I'm in a local sandbox, I I instantly get international accreditation. That doesn't seem to square with
It doesn't necessarily need to be international accreditation, but the sort of interaction, as I said, a lot of financial services businesses, in order to actually make the most out of your model, your test in the sandbox, you'd be quite limited by just sort of servicing the local market, or by just trying to attract investors from a local market. Now the UK, we have sort of beneficial environment really. We've got a big capital market, but also investors. Other jurisdictions across Europe that are trying to set up sandboxes don't have that benefit. They don't have a big investor community necessarily. They don't necessarily have sophisticated financial institutions or understanding their products. So to have, roll the concept out with greater utility, I think interaction between the regulators responsible for their own scope of sandboxes, to understand where the boundaries are when you're crossing a border, without necessarily having to get firms go to expensive lawyers for every single aspect of it, I think would be useful, or would increase the utility of the sandbox.
And finally, Richard, you mentioned that you're kind of, it's my client's problem really. I'm sitting back providing the software to do it. I was interested in Myles pointing out penetration testing being a big element of it. Who the hell are the FCA and why are they qualified to do it? And there are a lot of other standards out there, ISO 27000, which would happily push you through a process like that. Is that not the route you should be taking? And your client should be saying, well, we've actually purchased software which meets those requirements, and some of this stuff is redundant, not really part of an FCA remit.
I think ISO 27000, the different cyber protection and privacy protection standards are a lot broader than anything the FCA is looking at. So the FCA is particularly about behaviour with financial products. So the same, I think that's an extra test. So any vendor of enterprise software has to cope with pen tests and cyber protection, and any of them are bound by privacy rules and data protection, all that kind of stuff. It's only those that are working in regulated financial markets that have to worry about this. So I think this is extra. It needs doing, and innovation is urgently required in this space as it is elsewhere, and the FCA going the extra yard to help people understand the requirements, I think is thoroughly well-intentioned. Whether it's well executed, we'll learn, but it's certainly, I think, well-intentioned.
Thank you. Okay, folks, you're warmed up. It's over to you. Can I have a show of hands? So start with Jerry, if I could, up front.
If there's a regulatory failure when you're in the sandbox, which leads to customer detriment, what happens?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, what kind of liabilities are there? Do you have any safe harbour, or what happens on that?
Well, the sandbox can operate in a number of different ways. So you can be allowed to operate. You can be given, for example, no action enforcement letters. So the FCA may have identified that a particular rule might not work very well with your business case or your use case, and if they're able to waive it, they might waive the rule, or they might issue a letter which says that if you breach this rule, then we will not take action against you. But that will all be subject to quite prescriptive conditions as to how you will actually go about doing your activity within the sandbox.
Could you give us an example of such rules? It's kind of vague, If we have a more concrete example.
I mean, I think so. It would have to be something that doesn't derive from European regulation. So, for example, looking forward to later this year, you're going to have most of the financial sector is going to be brought within the scope of the senior managers regime. So, if you are and certification regime, if you are a regulated firm, you're going to need to have all sorts of people approved to do certain functions, and that you're going to have a sort of a documentary infrastructure in place. Now, the FCA has it within their gift to waive elements of that, on the basis, that the argument would be that for a startup operating in the sandbox, that it's disproportionate to apply, some of these new onerous governance rules to, firms that are basically just there to run a test to see whether or not their proposition will work. But if you are in the sandbox and you commit a regulatory breach, come back to a question, and it's not something that's been waived and it's not something for which you've got no enforcement action letter, you may still be subject to disciplinary action in the normal way as another regulated firm. That could result in consequences for the firm itself in terms of fines. It can also result in consequences for the individuals in terms of their ability to work in the industry again. But the FCA's goal is to ensure that it's clear enough what the limits are, what the firm can do whilst in sandbox, that the scope for doing something that is truly a breach would be a discipline.
If I can add to that quickly, so agree with all of that. Just to add, first of all, we had to have a very robust and very detailed withdrawal plan, unwind plan. So at any point in time, the FCA could go, not working, exit. We had to basically be able to unwind everything. And that's even after the transaction is complete. We had to be able to completely unwind it right from the beginning with no investors getting hurt in any way whatsoever. Secondly, we were, myself and others in the company, approved persons. So we were, from the point at which the FCA said, right, go ahead with the test, and we were putting the FCA register, we were then approved persons. So we're personally responsible and liable for any breach of conduct or breach of legislation.
I might take a couple of questions, so just hold on there.
Yeah.
Other hands as well?
Yes, this question for Myles, potentially Michael as well. Myles, thank you for the presentation, absolutely fantastic. So a couple of points. Competition. Did you find that there was alternative or perhaps complementary type solutions or even competitive solutions in that sandbox, perhaps in your cohort or previous cohorts? And how was that even an issue in the first place? And perhaps Michael may answer this one, how does the FCA perceive these types of different groups? While it may be an invention, it may be innovative and so on, there may be a couple of other firms that are trying to do pretty much the same thing. So does the FCA prioritize, the FCA pick one over the other, or bring all of them together? What's the approach to doing that?
There certainly was.
Other hands there? Sorry, Kathy, did you have your hand up? No. Oh, sorry.
Sure. Yeah, there certainly was competition, but in no way did we feel that was competition that we saw as real competition, in the sense that it's not because we're better than or anything. It was just because everyone was doing slightly different things, and ultimately it's a really big market. So we don't feel like there's significant competition. But to give you some examples, in a cohort ahead of us, there's a company called Nivora. Nivora just received investment from LSE. Good, great for them. They did a test in the sandbox, which was a blockchain bond. And it was a 1-week trade finance bond, all paid in crypto and reverse and everything. Really good test, and I think that helped us to be able to get into the sandbox in the first place by laying down some groundwork. We did something which was really different because it's equities, and honestly, it's a much harder regulatory piece to solve when it comes to equities. In our same sandbox, there were a couple of other firms. I won't mention names, but one of them is actually asking us to license our tech because they still don't have functioning tech, haven't completed their test. Another one that starts with the word block, and I won't say the rest, has gone bankrupt. So there's, it's been an interesting journey, but I think there are a lot of, certainly competition is a good thing, and from my impression of the FCA, they view different firms doing similar or slightly varied tests as a good thing, because it gives them more feedback and more use cases.
Yeah, I would say this is not a 1970s picking winners industrial strategy. So this is genuinely about trying to find innovative businesses and that genuinely have something to offer consumers. Whilst the FCA may on occasions feel that it's got enough of one particular type of firm coming, applying to be in a particular cohort in the sandbox, that doesn't mean that just because there are multiple firms with a similar business case that they are trying to whittle them down to the one that looks like the best proposition. There are transparent criteria. Also, it's worth bearing in mind the FCA is a public body. It's amenable to judicial review. So that means that if it's taking decisions that are discriminatory, non-transparent, if they are not being fair in their process, then they can be subject to judicial review. Whether any firm that is applying to go into the sandbox can afford to take the FCA to judicial review is another matter, but it's not beyond the realms of possibility.
I misread there, James, the gentleman beside Kathleen. I should have indicated this earlier, would you just think who you are and any affiliation you like everybody else to know?
Okay. I'm Raj Shadwani from DXC Technology. A question for Myles, great presentation, thank you. What is next for firms like you come out from the sandbox? Is it, I guess, scaling up your technology? Is it going into new markets? Is it sort of capturing your clients? What happens after you go through the stringent process? And you're probably worn out by the end of it. What do you do next?
Get some sleep, then try and make some money. We're exiting now. We're now trying to build out a marketing roadmap, starting to do some smaller transactions over the next few months, and then start to scale as the year draws to close, hopefully. So yeah, we're kind of kicking off our real business, so to speak.
The side of the room seems amazingly quiet. Is there anybody who wanted to kick in? Mark?
Sorry to Myles, I'm still a bit confused about the primary benefits of being in the sandbox. Was it A, that it made it easier for you to raise money because there's a certain kind of, you get credibility from the FCA association? Or is it primarily that, I would have thought from the outside looking in that you're there, the regulator's there, the interaction with the regulator would be easier, but you made 2 points about how it took them months to get back to you on things that could have taken half an hour. So that didn't seem to be the case, or is that misrepresenting your interaction with the FCA?
I think it's slightly misrepresenting because there are different elements to the interaction. So it wasn't, going into Sandbox certainly wasn't about raising funds for us. If we weren't regulated, we don't operate as a business, it's that simple. So we need a regulatory authorization. How do we get that authorization? As I mentioned in the beginning, we could apply outright, but because we're doing something so novel, I think it's unlikely that we would have gotten that authorization very easily, or even if we'd still have had it by now, it probably would have been a 2-year journey at least, I would guess. And let's be clear, I don't know if you've been through a regulatory process, but part of it's not just about saying, hey, I'd like these authorizations, and we're all stand-up people and we've got enough regulatory capital. Actually, there's a very detailed look at the business plan of the company, exactly how their processes work, what the risks are throughout, what protections there are to entities that we're dealing with, how we deal with outsourcer failures, everything. It's very detailed. So for us to present a regulatory body a completely novel technology and a new way of creating securities that has never been done before, I think it's unlikely we would have gotten authorization very easily. So for us, that was the main point of the sandbox.
Myles, that's a great presentation. You seem very chilled out, like it wasn't a stressful process. Could you just, I'm Donald Lawrence from CAS. Can you just expand on, are you talking about IPOs, ICOs, or just go a little bit more into the woods there about where you're going or where you got to?
Sure. So I have a 6-year-old that doesn't live with me, which is easy, and I have a negative 1-month-old. That I'm sure is going to be a stressful process. We are, at the moment, we're focused on private securities primarily. And so for that, call it what you will. Private shares, and in Q4 we are going to launch automated bond offerings. Now we're working towards solving for public securities, and there are a few other pieces which need to be in place, most noticeably under CSDR legislation. If you have MiFID transferable securities traded in MTF, then it has to be held in book entry form. this ESD. And we're working with some entities towards potentially a trial and some other solutions within that regulatory framework. So what would we call this in the sense of a IPO or ICO or whatever? Definitely not an ICO. We're not about crypto. We are about securities, equity, debt, convertibles eventually, other forms thereof. Would we call it an IPO? I would call it an alternative to an IPO. And actually we're speaking to an AIM-listed company right now that is looking to do a secondary offering away from AIM because their shares are incredibly illiquid and they'd like to diversify the shareholder base. They see the administrative gains that they get from it, etc. So we're labeling that as a digital security offering. A lot of people are trying to call it different things. I call it 6 Swiss and they're calling it I think it was an initial digital offering, an IDO. I'm sure there are going to be hundreds more acronyms that come out of this in the next couple of years. So yeah, that's where we're kind of placed.
Just as a follow-up though to Don's question, what sort of firms do you want to meet? There's an audience here. Who do you want to meet and what type of firms?
Sure. So that's an interesting question because actually I think it's something that we learned about ourselves throughout this process as well. We started off with the premise of being a capital raising entity and particularly that mid-cap size, so the alternative to AIM, that kind of size. Above where the crowdfunding platform is finished, because actually they've done a great job at streamlining some of that raising, but bringing institutions into the equation, institutional investors, smaller institutions, but that kind of that mid-cap range. And that's still our focus. But we realized as we went along that what we were creating was an administration platform, an automated administration platform was kind of a byproduct of the capital raising process. But actually, that was a much more powerful tool and time saver and cost saver for companies in the longer term. And speaking openly, from an entrepreneurial perspective, it's sticky revenue from the admin side that continues in perpetuity. So that's really great. And we realized that actually there's a slight pivot there. And so to come to your question, it's those mid-market issuers, which we're trying to do on the primary issue side. But absolutely in the longer term, we see ourselves as a much better version of CapDesk, Carta in the US that do all of that admin and ultimately custody as well. Thanks.
Final question or comment from the audience, sir? Yeah. Who you are and where you're from?
Myles, thank you very much. Pierre Sullivan from Align. We're a RegTech company, so I'm interested in your presentation. It was very good, thank you. Just one question. How do you deal with the regulator going forward? And how is that related? So 2 questions then. How is that relationship being established from the fact that you finished the sandbox and how it goes from there?
So we've got a handler, you can call it that, who's our official regulatory interface, who kind of is the funnel for all of our queries not on the sandbox side, on the regular FCA side. And we've had him for quite a long part of the FCA Sandbox journey, which has been great because we've got a rapport with the guy. He's a really nice guy. We're still giving him weekly updates on our business, on what's happening, because we've just kept that practice going from the actual sandbox. So I think the sandbox has helped us to establish what is probably a better interaction and dialogue with the FCA than we would have had otherwise had we just got a regular authorization. So I think that's probably another maybe unspoken positive. I just spoke it, but that being said, come back to the very painful question of Brexit and what we do next. And we haven't quite actually put in the application, but we're looking at putting in an arranging application in the Netherlands. That's just a straight out, that's not to the sandbox, that's just a straight out authorization. So I think that'll probably be a different relationship. But yeah, where we go next is, if we can continue just dealing with the FCA, that'll be great. If we have to deal with 2 regulators, well, so be it.
Thank you. Okay. Well, just a quick pause before some final comments from the panel. Panelists, while you're composing your thoughts, I just thought I'd leave the title tonight was the FCA Sandbox, an Innovation Beacon. And I am, it's all interesting to hear about the fun of bureaucracy and regulation and form filling and 15 policies, and it's all very sweet stuff. But it is touted as something that is supposed to be helping innovation. Go back to my opening comment, it was that drive to why wasn't there more innovation coming out of the UK that arguably was one of, there are many reasons for this, but one of the primary reasons. And I'll turn to you in order if I can. Richard, is this actually an innovation beacon?
I'm going to say that it is, and I'm going to say that it is particularly answering Mark's question in an even more positive way than Myles did. I've been involved in a challenger bank startup. It's taken 3 years and a great deal more capital to get started. Now, banking technically is a license to print money. You know, the creation of credit is the creation of money. So I expect that to be a difficult regulatory hurdle. And capital is more easily available to fund that process. So I'm not crying on behalf of challenger banks. But for you to have got a much more complicated technical range of services that you're offering than the bank that I've been involved with through, frankly, 12 months ago when you told me what you were going to do, I didn't invest because I didn't believe you'd do it. And I doubt you would have done it without that regime, and it's the only experience I've had of it. So I think it is very important. It's time to market, halve the time to market, you halve the capital cost, and you double the speed of innovation. So I think it's win-win between the innovator and the regulator.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's valuable and it's useful. I mean, we see getting authorised, well, in order to do regulated activities in this country, as in most developed nations, you need to be authorised or find a way of falling within an exemption. That is a long and expensive process, and it puts a lot of people off. It's a hurdle to getting a business off the ground. Those sorts of hurdles are disincentives for investment into new businesses. So having a process whereby firms can prove their concept, get close to the regulator, get themselves an understanding of the regulatory environment, and have the regulator get to understand their business and their unique offering is helpful, and it's useful. And I think it has changed the perception of the UK financial services industry. There's all part of Project Innovate, which was very successful in creating the impression of London as the world's sort of fintech hub, whatever fintech means. But it's still good to have it around whilst we're sort of battling against the uncertainty that's caused by other regulatory developments that are currently living through. But it's also something that other regulators have recognised around the world as being a useful, I suppose, I wouldn't say the word innovation, but for themselves, useful to have something that they're calling a sandbox. It's an element. It's something that they can say is an innovation to a good PR to bring people into their jurisdiction and say, look, we're open for business and we are encouraging of people wanting to take a risk and to do something new. Now, the UK has got their first and probably has the most rigorous process around it, so from a systemic risk perspective, I'm more comfortable with that. But, yeah.
Myles?
Yeah, well, if the sandbox didn't exist, I wouldn't be sitting here. So I do think that it is an innovation beacon. I do think with all the other regulatory stuff that's going on and some of financial services going across the continent and everything else that's happening, I think one point that the UK can shine on is encouraging innovation. And if you look at the unicorns, the tech companies which are dominating the world now, then the US is first, the UK is second, and I think that's outstanding. And hopefully this is one element that can help to continue and encourage that.
Well, that's been an excellent discussion, and I'm very conscious I'm the only one between you and a few drinks. I myself was particularly quite encouraged by some of that. The Navaru, who Myles mentioned, was actually here about 18 months ago, from memory. We had a pretty good discussion with them, and that was as they were really getting into things. I think it's also exciting for me that the financial services industry is actually learning from other industries for a change, rather than being as isolated because the person who suggested sandboxes in the first place was Professor Sir Mark Walport, who was doing this as a kind of why didn't financial services do what's done in other industries, for example, pharmaceuticals with clinical trials. Why weren't there ways in which people could experiment? So I think that's been good. There were a couple of points tonight where we were talking about new onerous governance rules. I like that when a lawyer says new onerous governance rules. So that sort of candor I'm not used to. But that's a bit scary. And I think it was interesting, I can't remember who said, helps to educate the regulators. And I sometimes wonder if we do give too much credence to that. Shouldn't the regulators be educating themselves? But I think it was a good session tonight, and certainly everybody seems to come away with a more positive attitude towards the sandbox. And I must say in the last two closing comments in particular, anything that helps us function competitively here in the City of London and in the UK is surely a good thing. Just before we close, I thought I'd point out we've got some events coming up. The Future of Trade Associations on the 11th of June is the next one looming. Should be very, very interesting. We're going to have a big diversion on the 17th of June. We're going to be launching a book that's called Gresham's Law, and John Guy, the Tudor historian, is going to explain Gresham's Law to us, which has relevance today. And that's also going to be done in a different location over at the Guildhall Library, where on Monday a new exhibition opens on Sir Thomas Gresham, to which the FS Club and CN have contributed original materials and things like that. So even if you can't make the 17th of June, you can spend 15 minutes at the Guildhall Library for free and have a good old look. And as ever, the rest is on the website. So before we head to drinks and further discussion, thanking you, the audience, for your participation, but would you please join me in thanking Myles for a brilliant presentation, and our two panelists, Richard and Michael, for helping us to see the sandbox in the round. Thank you very much, gentlemen.